Hello, everyone, and welcome to NCJR's webinar on modernizing your business with inclusion. My name is Crystal Berger, NCJR's Chief Innovation Officer. And first, let's go over today's format. Today's session will be recorded and available at ncjr.com, as well as NCJR's YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you during the presentation, so please enter your questions into the Q&A, and our presenters will answer your questions toward the end. Today, we will be defining diversity, equity, and inclusion in real estate, discussing where the real estate industry is with DE&I, and providing some best practices for your real estate business. So now let's give a warm welcome to today's panelist, Farrah Wilder of the California Association of Realtors. She is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, as well as Laurie Benner, the Associate Vice President of Programs for the National Fair Housing Alliance. Laurie, excuse me, guys, I'm kind of reading the bios here. I just got them today, so just bear with me a moment. As the Associate Vice President of Programs for the National Fair Housing Alliance, Laurie Benner is responsible for developing and managing national programs and partnerships designed to provide equitable access to fair and affordable housing opportunities. Laurie has decades of experience working in the housing nonprofit space, including recent work with the Maryland Realtors Association in managing housing redevelopment in Baltimore City. She holds an MBA and lives in Maryland, where she is active on many nonprofit boards. And Farrah Wilder is with the California Association of Realtors. She is their Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Farrah supports California Association's fair housing and inclusion efforts by collaborating with internal and external partners and stakeholders, including California Realtor members, various Realtor associations across the nation, like NCJR, and on other initiatives that will dramatically heighten awareness and allyship, equity, and capabilities within the real estate industry and beyond. Farrah is also an attorney, and she worked for the San Francisco nonprofit Equal Rights Advocates and the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. Without further ado, I will hand the stage over to Farrah.
Okay, sorry. It took me a moment to figure out how to unmute myself. Hello, everyone. It's so great to be with you today, and it's really an honor to be invited to share this information with all of you. And I see some folks, from far and wide, some friends. So it's great to see some familiar faces, and always a pleasure to be here with Laurie. And thanks to Crystal and Bill for inviting us. So we're going to talk about diversity and kind of the relation to fair housing. And really, this is a presentation, let me see if I can find the controls here, that is for, everyone, every realtor, every real estate professional in their day-to-day business. So here's our agenda. We're going to go through some DEI basics. So for some of you, you've been through the DEI basics, you've read the book, so just bear with us and it might be a good refresher. And then Laurie will talk about fair housing and DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then it'll come back to me and I'll cover best business practices. And then Laurie will talk about national efforts and solutions. And then we'll offer some of our favorite resources and some of the sources that we use to put together this presentation. Okay. So the basics. So want to start with some definitions because, we don't want to just use these terms and not have everyone on the same page about what we're talking about. So diversity is simply the mix, the different groups that make up the larger group, the different demographic categories. So think about race, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, disability. It's not just race, but it's just simply the who. Inclusion is it's a concept that really makes diversity impactful. So it's about having a mix of folks involved in your business, in your group, in your neighborhood, and making sure that everyone feels welcome, is participating, and has the ability to help shape your business, shape your team, shape your brokerage, and has an opportunity to lead and be, really at the forefront of any effort, whether it's, like I said, your team or your business. or your neighborhood or your realtor association. And then equity, you'll hear the word equity when we talk about DEI. And I've had folks where we use the word equity, and I've gotten emails where people are saying, why aren't you using equality? I feel like the word equity sounds unfair. And a really great way to think about equity is that, every group needs something different. So the things that seniors need, the things that people who have disabilities might need, and there's different disabilities, so accommodations will need to be very specific to address the needs of any particular given community. So equity allows for a tailored solution for the needs of that community. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about language barriers for certain communities. Okay, so diversity benefits. So it's really important to make the business case for diversity, because there's so many things that, in your real estate business, compliance things you have to think about, marketing, all of these things you have to do as a real estate professional. So it's kind of like one more thing. Diversity, is that something that I really need to think about? And I would suggest that every single business that wants to make sure that it is responsive to the needs of the community that it wants to serve should be considering, really needs to be considering diversity. So it's a business imperative. So realtor associations, for example, and oftentimes I give this presentation to realtor associations, but you can swap in brokerages, you can swap in real estate teams. Businesses are serving diverse communities. So diversity is something that needs to be on the radar. 67% of job seekers consider diversity when evaluating companies and job offers. And I'm going to tell you, when I was a realtor, for 13 years, and I wanted to switch companies. And I looked at the roster and wanted to see, and I was in Oakland, California, and Oakland is a diverse area. My clients were diverse. I'm a Black woman. I wanted to make sure that this would be an environment that my clients could come to the office, that I would feel comfortable working, I just wanted to work somewhere that valued diversity. So I looked at that roster, I looked at the pictures, and it really was important to me. And I would suggest that clients of all ethnicities, maybe not even looking for their own, but just value diversity, especially right now, where we're really talking more and more about diversity in society. Diverse teams make better decisions 87% of the time. So this is based on research. I like to say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, this is not something I've made up, by the way. I don't know who made it up, but I love this quote. If you want to go far, go together. So if you've got a number of different perspectives, different ways of looking at things coming into the decision making, you're going to maybe catch more things where if you had a blind spot, you wouldn't have caught it. You're going to have a lot of different perspectives weighing in. Sometimes it's a little frustrating because you just want to make the decision and just go, but those diverse teams can really help make a well-rounded decision, and the research supports that. And then inclusive companies, this is another data point that is about the same thing, outperform others 8-1. And so we had a great speaker who gave us these statistics, some of these statistics, Dr. Stephanie Johnson, and I have a link. We have information about her book at the end of the presentation, but she's a wonderful resource and has a book called Inclusify, and it's all about inclusion. Okay, so the importance of diversity. So different groups have different needs. So think about language, people of color, and I would say there are people of color who have quite a bit of resources to buy homes, but because of the history of discrimination, people of color tend to have less family generational wealth to put towards buying a home. So there are different needs sometimes for people of color. There are cultural differences, again, not to stereotype, but certain communities tend to, have different kinds of needs. For example, my dad and lived in an in-law unit because he came to live with me in California, and I was helping him with his healthcare. And it's common, for certain groups to live intergenerationally, and so there are different cultural needs sometimes. And so it's really helpful if you have a diverse team, or if you have diversity within your company, you can really have more understanding and more capacity to even address some of these different needs. Bias is a liability, and so there's both basic compliance needs where we talk about diversity and fair housing, and then there's it does make a lot of business sense, but simply it's inadvertent different treatment may violate fair housing laws. And if you have a more diverse team, and if you have a more diverse surroundings and people around you who represent different groups of folks, you are much more likely to have less bias yourself, or those folks may have less bias towards members of their own community. So making sure that you have diverse teams and diverse offices and diverse business partnerships can really help reduce the chances that there's going to be some sort of bias that leads to different treatment, which could be a liability. And then, of course, diversity is here. And I have some statistics at the bottom you might be able to see. And I hope I say this county right. Passaic County is 43% Latino. And I didn't, do all the statistics, but, and you're probably more aware than I am. Morris County is 10% Asian, and Essex County is 42% Black. And again, diversity is not just about race, but, all different kinds of folks buy homes and have business needs, and they want to see themselves sometimes in the companies or the offices or teams they work with, and also it can really, like I said, help with understanding of different communities. Okay, so I want to touch on history because there is a link between our diversity issues in the real estate industry and our fair housing and homeownership gap challenges that we continue to have. And so, again, some of you may know this, but as I'm talking to a realtor group, it's really important to understand our role in the history and in these gaps that we see, and also our role in making things better. So to sensitively work with individuals from underserved communities, and that's where a lot of your diversity comes in, it can help to be aware that realtors once played a central role in initiating and upholding policies that kept people of color from owning homes. And it's an unfortunate history. This is not a presentation about that, but I've done full presentations about it. It's like a college course. There's unfortunately a lot of history there. Many people of color have trauma related to this past exclusion, and they may feel gaslighted if the history is dismissed as false or irrelevant. And so, there are folks who can remember, or their families experienced foreclosure or a taking or exclusion, and or they just might feel like there might be bias in the process. And so being sensitive to that as a business person can be helpful, because this history exists for communities of color. And when you're sensitive, it can really help build some bridges, and forge a connection. And then the history also helps to explain the racial wealth and homeownership gaps, as well as continued bias against some of these communities. And there are a lot of stereotypes and myths that are ascribed to communities of color, and maybe that they don't understand the value of homeownership, or don't need to learn better money saving habits as to why they don't have a higher homeownership rate. But this history is really suggests a different nexus for the reason why these homeownership gaps exist. Okay, so let's go into the history just a bit. So early realtors, and this is across the country. So I did this research for California, but what I found is that the things that each realtor associations were doing at the local, state level, and at the national level, there was a passing of information. So what was NAR, which I think the acronym was NAREB at the time, was an organization that was kind of serving as, just like they do now, a resource for all of these different associations and passing information. So realtors were into the lobbying, but they were also building communities. They were doing residential development. And in that residential development, they were involved in putting in restrictive covenants that restricted communities to be exclusively white, or restricted certain ethnicities from living or buying homes in those communities. And there was a link between valuation of properties and race. So it was seen as potentially risky, or could decrease the property value if you had an integrated community, or if you had people of color in your community. And so there were policies and practices put into place, and unfortunately this impacted the appraisal industry as well, that led to exclusion, and it was a requirement. Article 34, as you can see down there, was of the Realtor Code, required realtors to actually abide by these racially restrictive policies. So realtor associations were elite, exclusive. Women at those early times were excluded, as well as people of color. And I will say the realtor associations did not allow people of color did not enter realtor associations until the 1960s. So this exclusion lasted for a very long time. And I would say, like, our California Realtor Association started in the 1905 was when CAR, and we had some locals that were even before that. Okay, so there are three kind of big ways that racial segregation was embedded into, these communities, and you probably can still see the legacy of some of that now. But again, our Realtor Code of Ethics, we've talked about restrictive covenants, and I have an example here on this slide, and I'm glad to share the presentation with you. And by the way, Crystal, we had a typo on the other one, so I'll give you one without a typo. And then the Federal Housing Administration. So that is the central bank that allowed for there to be 30-year fixed loans. So that came about in the 1930s. And realtors were involved in lobbying the government to create this. And when they did that, a lot of the policies and practices that realtors already had. So remember, our 1924 Code of Ethics had this requirement to steer and to perpetuate segregation. And so those valuation standards and policies made it to the redlining maps that the federal government used. And so the lasting impacts that we still see to this day are persistent segregation, wealth and homeownership gaps, persistent bias, and industry-wide diversity challenges. So it's really important to understand and be aware and conscious why we have these issues when we think about, kind of starting to address them. So now I'm going to move things over. I've stopped my share to Laurie.
That's great, Farrah. And I would like to point out, Farrah touched on this in her remarks about how women were once excluded from being Realtor members. And given that March is National Women's History Month, I am thrilled to share the stage here with two boss ladies in Crystal and Farrah. And I know that NAR has done a lot of research that shows how foundational that women are in home buying right now, particularly single women. So with that, I will go ahead and share my presentation. If I can find it. This is what happens. We just tested this out prior to coming online here. So I'm going to start out my presentation with a very, very powerful video. And this, of course, focuses on the Black homeownership gap specifically. But it's about 5 minutes long, but it's really powerful, and it really sets the stage for some of my remarks and also emphasizes some of Farrah's as well. So just bear with us. Again, it's about 5 minutes long.
How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. We don't own anything. We don't own anything.
As a black person in America, I just need the key. What key? Home ownership. Unlocking the doors of opportunity and wealth for myself and my community. 7 out of 10 white Americans own a home, while only 4 out of 10 black Americans own a home. The average white American's net worth is $171,000, but for black Americans, it's only $17,000. Do the math, that's 10 times more wealth. This gap in our country is a tragic disappointment. Something is wrong with our American dream. After 246 years of enslaving Africans, followed by 154 years of systematic oppression, are we surprised with these results? Just like any other American, I want to own a home, leaving a legacy for my family and community. But is the game fixed and not in my favor? Let's look to the past for answers. Sitting at the feet of my ancestors, they tell me stories of being stolen from their homes in Africa and sold as property. Stories of the American Constitution declaring that all are created equal, while simultaneously claiming enslaved Africans were only 3/5 human. They were called property. Tell me, how can property own a home? Sitting at the feet of my ancestors, they tell me how they were emancipated from slavery and exiled into 100 years of segregation and discrimination. Stories about Jim Crow laws forcing them into separate bathrooms, schools, restaurants, and neighborhoods. I hear of 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where bigots, steeped in white supremacist ideals, burned down Black Wall Street, destroying their thriving businesses and homes. They were called exiles. Tell me, how can exiles own a home? Sitting at the feet of my ancestors, they tell me how they were quarantined like a disease after the Great Depression. The Federal Housing Administration drew red lines around their communities, marking them as undesirable. They share painful memories of banks denying them credit and then being sold crooked contracts by predatory lenders. And in 1926, the Supreme Court allowed white Americans to ban them from purchasing homes on their street. They were called a disease. Tell me, how can a disease own a home? Property, exiles, disease. If that's how our ancestors were seen, how could they win? The game was fixed. But from the ashes they rose as people, not property, as citizens, not exiles, as healing, not a disease. Harriet Tubman knew she wasn't property, freeing the enslaved from physical and mental bondage on the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass knew he wasn't an exile, declaring that to have a home, one must have a country. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew he wasn't a disease, preaching healing and then losing his life in a fight for civil rights, economic equality, and fair housing. The week after his assassination, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, making it illegal to keep Black Americans, like my grandparents, from owning homes. Tubman, Douglass, King. They started this battle for true liberty and justice for all. Today, we're standing on their shoulders, boldly fighting to defend policies like the Community Reinvestment Act and Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform. Laws that are helping close the devastating wealth gap created by America's transgressions of slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining. So as a Black person in America, grabbing the keys to home ownership, I open the doors of opportunity and wealth for myself and my family. My hope is realizing an America that collectively acknowledges the wrongs done in our past and boldly roots out inequality in our present, that forever invests in Black lives and communities. A solid foundation has been established, but much is left to build. Our generation, empowered by honest lenders and protected by federal laws, can create wealth and close the gap. Because America is our country. This is our home, and it is our time to rise.
Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
Pretty powerful stuff, right? I think I've watched this video dozens of times, and every time it gives me the chills. And I'm happy to share with you the two pieces of legislation that were mentioned in that video, Dodd-Frank and the Community Reinvestment Act. Some of my colleagues at the National Fair Housing Alliance were instrumental in crafting those. So that leads us into talking about National Fair Housing Alliance, NFHA. Who are we? What are we? NFHA is a 33-year-old nonprofit civil rights organization that works to eliminate housing discrimination and to ensure equal housing opportunity through leadership, education, outreach, member services, public policy, community development, advocacy, and enforcement. We have a huge portfolio of housing-related work that we do. We also serve as a trade association for fair housing centers across the country. Fair housing is really the center of NFHA, and it's also the center of all of our lives, housing. It's where we live is intrinsically connected to opportunity and success. From the real estate industry perspective, we tend to think of fair housing through an almost exclusively discrimination-focused lens. At NFHA, we consider fair housing to be a broader civil rights issue. When people are offered equitable resources and opportunities to secure safe and affordable housing, they have endless possibilities. This outcome is not just good for those individuals and family themselves, but for all of us. Our communities are stronger and healthier when they are more equitable. Opportunity, or lack thereof, determines where people live, and where people live determine their access to technology, healthcare, transportation, education, employment, all of the things you see on this slide here. And it further determines personal and family wealth. Homeownership issues tend to be a touchy subject when we get into matters of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity. And I'm sure that every single one of us has seen in social media comments, people getting upset when we discuss diverse individuals. And I don't mean upset about the injustice. I mean upset because they deny that the discrimination exists or feel that they're being blamed. And Farrah touched on that a little bit in her presentation, but that's exactly why it's important to continue to highlight the historical education, to understand why we're focusing on these efforts. It's important to understand how we got here in the first place. And I'll touch on some of those in my remarks today. Now, the irony is not lost on me that my remarks today and some of Farrah's tend to focus more on race and national origin than other diverse groups. But from my perspective, that's because my professional work really centers around racial disparities. The foundation of my presentation really begins with the fact that the racial homeownership gap today is wider than when discrimination was legal. It's a natural human response to want to surround yourself with people who are most like you, but it makes sense to make sure that you're comfortable and prepared to interact with all types of people. The racial composition of this country is changing exponentially. It's predicted that in the next 20 years, there will be no racial majority in this country. The racial homeownership gap is directly related to the racial wealth gap. White households have 10 times the wealth of Black households and 8 times the wealth of Latino households. Of course, there's not just an ownership gap, but there's also a home value gap. Property in white hands is often valued more than property in Black hands, and homes owned by Black individuals typically don't accrue value at the same rate. Now, while it's not captured on this slide, it's important to note that these stark figures occurred even though race and national origin were added as protected classes over 50 years ago. It's only been 1 year since HUD extended protections to LGBTQ individuals by way of sexual orientation and gender identity. But this category of discrimination is rampant, and we are seeing complaints increase exponentially. So I mentioned before that where you live determines your access to financial amenities. Overwhelmingly, white neighborhoods have far more access to mainstream financial institutions, while communities and neighborhoods of color have exponentially more check cashing establishments, pawn shops, and payday lenders. As a result, people of color disproportionately access credit outside of the mainstream, and leads to these consumers being disproportionately credit invisible or having deflated credit scores. So when we talk about these disparities, a lot of the defense comes in that, well, oh, these particular categories of people just don't have good credit. They're not handling their finances adequately. And that is absolutely not the case. There are systemic issues at play here that directly lead into some of these credit and financial disparities. You can see here that only 25% of Black individuals in the US have a credit score of over 700. The number is much lower in many areas. So it makes some sense then that the higher rate of credit insecurity amongst Black and Latino Americans means that they're denied mortgages at a higher rate by the country's largest lending institutions. And it also makes sense that they tend to be more credit invisible than their white counterparts. Unfortunately, banks are closing branches at a higher rate in Black areas than they are, in affluent Black areas than they are in less affluent white ones. So you can see just based on that, that again, it really does, come down to a racial issue. It's not an issue of a business case for these banks. It's not an issue of that in less affluent neighborhoods that they're going to get, less business from there. It really, unfortunately, does come down to race. So you might ask yourself, now that we're more than 50 years past the height of the civil rights movement, how do these disparities remain? And Farrah did touch on this very well in her presentation. Decades, centuries really, of government-created laws and policies designed to segregate, discriminate, and to deny opportunities of people of color. By now, most of you have seen these redlining maps and know that FHA use these maps in their lending decisions. We know that Black military veterans were denied use of their benefits. And Black individuals who were able to buy homes were often limited to abusive and predatory land contract purchases. So another common practice to keep the quote unquote the integrity of a neighborhood was through the use of restrictive covenants. And although these practices are sometimes decades old, inequality lingers. The systemic infrastructure designed to perpetuate racial inequality has had lasting effects. Generational wealth has been lost. Generational support of homeownership has been lost. And unfortunately, a well-earned overarching distrust of housing professionals and lending institutions has created more barriers. In fact, the crushing student loan debt disproportionately impacts Black individuals, and that's tied to the absence of generational wealth. So while a lot of these, a lot of this information and a lot of what we're talking about how realtors were complicit in these past efforts, helped create, helped sustain, the message here is not necessarily one of, of shame. It's making a point that realtors are a powerful, powerful voice in housing. And so that same power and that same collective action can be used for good, can be used to advance solutions in your communities, in your neighborhoods, in your states and cities, to create housing opportunity for everyone. Now, there's a ripple effect to the ongoing discrimination. Lower housing values equates to lower property tax, which in turn impacts school funding. Poor educational opportunities are tied to lower levels of future employment and household income, which of course perpetuates a cycle. Moreover, community disinvestment depresses areas economically and creates poor health outcomes. Industrial and toxic waste facilities are disproportionately found in Black neighborhoods or in neighborhoods with a high concentration of low income and non-white residents. And that's of course connected to redlining. The zip code where a child grows up is the best predictor of life expectancy and future success. So it's easy for people to ignore this plight if they feel it doesn't directly impact them, but the truth is that reversing inequities has a net positive effect for all of us. Keeping up this status quo will really cost the economy over $1 trillion over a 10-year period. So when we talk about the business imperative for inclusion, that is a piece of that. Now, some hot topics related to housing, fair housing, housing opportunity. You may have seen on the news that NFHA recently announced a historic settlement with Fannie Mae for their treatment of real estate owned or REO properties post-housing crisis. A large-scale investigation showed that Fannie Mae was properly maintaining properties in white areas, but not in communities of color. Those homes were allowed to deteriorate with lawn care and exterior maintenance ignored. The $53 million settlement is one of the largest in the history of the Fair Housing Act, and those funds will be used to support community revitalization and homeownership efforts in the communities impacted. And I'm happy to say that there are areas of New Jersey that are included in that and other. We also have similar lawsuits pending with Bank of America and Deutsche Bank. So recently, the National Fair Housing Alliance and its partners, Dane Law Firm and Christensen Law Firm, released a federally funded report that raises serious concerns about appraisals. The report represents the most comprehensive review of appraisal bias to date, and also presents a roadmap for Congress, regulators, advocates, and other industry professionals to come up with solutions and to change the systems that are in place right now. We're all hearing frequent stories, unfortunately, about appraisals of homes owned by Black individuals coming back suspiciously low. That same owner will remove any evidence that a Black family lives there by removing personal photos, art, literature, sometimes even having a white friend meet the appraiser. And then the new appraisal comes back magically, sometimes as much as $500,000 higher. This issue should be of special concern to real estate agents because it directly impacts your clients and the communities in which you work. So NFHA is also working on removing bias in computer algorithms that impact consumers by way of appraisals, mortgages, rental decisions, insurance prices, employment, and more. That's our Tech Equity Initiative. We also are working hard on legislative and public policy efforts to ensure equality for all people in housing and financial matters. And that looks like some lending solutions, such as special purpose credit programs that I will touch on later, and also down payment assistance for first generation home buyers, which, as you know, they tend to be first generation home buyers largely tend to be people of color. So this is the kind of foundation for the solutions that come later. And I will turn it back over to Farrah now to pick back up on some best practices that you can use in your real estate business.
Okay, thank you so much, Laurie. So, I find sometimes it's really important to understand all the big picture information with all of this, but I think for people who are kind of working in their business, it can seem overwhelming. It's like, well, what can I do in my day-to-day business practices that can address some of these big societal systemic issues? And actually, I have great news. There are some things that you can do in your business to actually, help move the needle on some of these things. So one of the easiest things, and it's something we all, need to do, we do it at CAR, is making sure that any kind of images or marketing that you have is diverse. So super easy, if you have, kind of your stock photos and things like that, you can just make sure that they represent diversity. Also, adding a statement that says something about your commitment to fair housing and diversity, and that you, enjoy, want to welcome, folks from different backgrounds, some of your, maybe talking about specializations that you have that, will signal that you are committed to diversity and fair housing, will attract those particular kinds of clients, or even show, just like we talked about, job seekers or people who are looking to work with someone scanning websites. It'll signal that, you're a diverse and inclusive business. And so one thing I just want to say, and it's right here at the bottom of the slide, be sure to make sure that you're doing something more than just the photos, because that kind of thing is criticized as performative. There's, there are businesses where all it is the photos, and everything else is, it's not diverse there. They don't have initiatives. They haven't examined their diversity. They aren't examining bias. So that's just the beginning, but it's really important first step, and something I don't think you would want to avoid, and super easy to do. Okay, so develop diverse market skills and resources. And I've given some statistics to back up, or some data points to back up each of these recommendations. So learn about first-time buyer programs. And the reason why is because we talked about all this history and all of, the exclusion, and, at one time, discrimination was actually legal. And so, we have, and we still have these resulting biases and continued challenges that we're working on. So first-time buyer programs can help people with less generational wealth. So we have Latinos on here are twice as likely to purchase a home with FHA financing than non-Hispanic white buyers. Similarly, Black borrowers are 61% more likely to rely on non-conventional loans like FHA. And Laurie touched on this as well. Black households are more likely to have student loan debt and student loan burden than white ones. So down payment assistance, home buyer assistance programs can be really helpful, and educating your seller clients. So if you have a seller that you're helping, making sure they understand, and understanding the programs themselves. They may actually not slow down the process. They may not have many differences from other kinds of loans. So, and also maybe even suggesting, of course, you don't want to raise bias or any kind of ethnic data when talking about the buyer with the seller, but that these programs really can help, individuals who may not have access to generational wealth or home can, tap home equity, also be able to be competitive in the market. And then lenders, HUD counselors, and referral partners. So you may have a niche. Maybe you only do listings or help investors or something like that. Or, it might be that you're not sure about down payment assistance programs or anything like that. Making sure that you're connected to folks who have an understanding of the programs. There's some lenders that specialize. They're approved for all the programs. HUD counselors can really help better support these particular kinds of clients, whether they come to you and you're going to work with them, or you might get a referral partner where it's that person really specializes or knows down payment assistance programs or first-time buyer programs or works with a lot of buyers, or maybe there's someone with a language proficiency. So there's a data point at the bottom. A majority of Asian and Pacific Islanders are limited English proficient. So and LEP also poses a barrier for many Latino home buyers. So maybe, you might not have that language proficiency, but knowing someone that you can send a client to kind of keep them in the mix, keep them in the loop, and that could really help them. And also, I was a realtor myself, there's referral fees. So building your referral networks to be able to support a variety of different clients, even if you're not going to expand your team, or you don't have room to expand your brokerage, can be a great way to, use these diversity principles to make sure that your business is able to accommodate all kinds of different needs in your community. And then another thing, never tell someone they can't buy. So you might find out, you might do an initial interview with someone and find out they have a lower credit score than you think could qualify for a loan, or that they might not have enough funds to purchase a home in your market. And I would say that there may be a program, there might be something, but a lot of people who believe they might have a challenge purchasing, particularly people of color, particularly people who don't have family support for a purchase, are easily discouraged. It can be really difficult. And I've been at these great presentations with NAREP and KREP where we talk about self-employed buyers. So in certain communities, self-employment is more common. And, then in some communities, not using credit is also more common. So the profile is going to look different. It's also going to be a bigger leap to get pre-approved, maybe not impossible. So when you're coming in with this feeling that it's going to be difficult to buy, and then someone goes, I don't know how to help you, I don't think you can buy, some of those folks give up. And there may be a program, a lender, or an easy fix that will allow them to stay in the market. And as we know, interest rates are rising and home prices have been rising. They may still continue to rise. And so if someone could get in there before they get priced out, that can be really powerful and put them on the path. So making sure that you've got those connections, that maybe it's a HUD counselor who can help work with someone so they can figure out how to kind of get over that particular hurdle, or connect them with a lender that can help them, can help keep people in the mix. And so I have some statistics and data points here about how important it is for particular communities to build wealth through homeownership. In particular, for Black families, home equity is 70% of their net worth compared to 59% for white households. And for the LGBTQ community, 55% said they wouldn't buy in an area if they were unsure about being accepted. So it's really important through your interactions, through your messaging, through everything that you do to really say, to these various communities, this is a place where you are welcome, and, we are here to help you. And then in a survey of real estate agents working with Latino buyers, 17.3% reported that their FHA borrowers gave up on their home searches. So again, there are these bigger hurdles. So making sure that, even if you're not completely aware of how you might support someone, finding a strong referral partner or keeping people in the mix is going to be really helpful for making sure that you are a force for helping to increase these home ownership numbers. Okay, so team company actions. So I've got a couple of different concepts on here that I want to chat about. So think about when you're hiring, as maybe you have a brokerage, or maybe you're looking for an assistant, you're expanding your team, or you're going to partner. Think about diversity, when you're doing that, because of course it, like we said, kind of helps you support a greater, a more broad array of folks if maybe you have different capacities or different backgrounds on your team. Be inclusive. So if you've got a team or you've got a brokerage, kind of be thinking about ways to get input or allow everyone to contribute. Of course, realtors develop systems, and I remember that, at some point, I kind of had my process down pat. But allowing different, maybe newer folks from different backgrounds to kind of add to the mix, and even have a voice and maybe move up within the company, can really allow for, both a business opportunity for those folks, but for your business to open up to a more diverse array of clientele. And then allyship. So allyship is really making sure that you're, truly a true supporter and champion of groups that you might not be in. I'm not in every group, I'm in a few, but we all can kind of learn more about, read books, watch videos, about the challenges of different communities, and then also find ways to elevate those voices, speak up when we see something going on that doesn't seem quite right, when we see a microaggression. So, exercising those allyship skills can be really helpful as far as fostering diversity in your environment, in your business, in your organizations. And then mentorship. So consider, partnering up or finding ways to connect with maybe a new realtor, or kind of talking at community colleges or real estate courses, and kind of sharing the knowledge that you have with various folks, and they might come from different backgrounds, because they're going to take that expertise and maybe use that within their communities, or to help open doors elsewhere. I mean, I had a lot of mentors in my career, who I worked at a company, and unfortunately the company I ended up with right before I stopped doing real estate, I was the only Black agent there, which was odd because it was in Oakland, and Oakland is a diverse place. And I had mentors there. There were people who had been in the business for many, many years. And I had been in the business for some years, 5 years by the time I got there. But, we're talking 20 plus years. And and also there was reverse mentoring. I knew about some loan programs that they weren't aware of. So that partnership was really helpful for my career. And I would probably still be there had I not ended up falling into this job with CAR. But mentorship can be really helpful and important. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it back over to, if I can figure out how to stop my share, to Laurie.
Wow, we are we're breezing right through these slides today, which is good because we'll have time for more Q&A towards the end. So the good news is that in a lot of these efforts that we've talked about, or some of these challenges that we've talked about, that there are solutions. So it can be very, very daunting for an organization, a real estate brokerage, an association, especially at the local level. It can be very daunting for with all of these issues in total, where to start, how to begin, how to lean in. But again, the good news is there's a lot of national initiatives happening right now, and a lot of national attention to these issues, so that there's a framework already in place. And so you in your team, your brokerage, your local association can look to some of these efforts as a template, or to get some ideas. From NFHA, we have an initiative called Keys Unlock Dreams, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But Keys Unlock Dreams and some of these other organizations you see listed here are part of the Black Home Ownership Collaborative's 3x30 effort. And what that is, it's a national organizational, I'm sorry, I've been told here that there's some blocking on my screen. All right, hopefully that's taken care of now. The 3x30's initiative's goal is to have 3 million net new Black homeowners by 2030. And so all of these organizations, dozens of them, are coming together really to lock arms and move forward together to try to make a dent in that gap. NAREP, the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, just had an amazing conference. In fact, I have their report, the 2021 report, the State of Hispanic Homeownership, right here next to me, because it was an amazing conference. So I would encourage you, all of you, to look to the local chapters of NAREB, of NAREB, of ARIA, to develop partnerships. Do you have a housing counseling organization, a local fair housing organization? Look to these various groups, and one that's actually not on here is the LGBTQ Real Estate Alliance. All of these groups really hone in on their specific audiences, their diverse groups of people, and that's not just for agents to join, but that's also that they're really plugged into the issues in the various areas, and you can help you can help push those efforts forward. So Keys Unlock Dreams is the initiative that I am managing for the National Fair Housing Alliance. It is a 10-city, 3-year initiative, which has 5 main goals, and those are these here on the screen. And that is to remove structural barriers that perpetuate racial inequity, to expand affordable and fair housing options, to prevent an unbalanced recovery from the COVID pandemic, to provide consumers, prospective home buyers and other stakeholders, industry partners, realtors, realtor organizations and associations, with information, research, and resources to help push these goals forward. And the overarching goal is really to help close the racial wealth and homeownership gaps. One of the solutions that I mentioned before are special purpose credit programs. Now, special purpose credit programs have been allowed since the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. So these particular lending programs are a great way for lenders to develop targeted solutions to closing these homeownership gaps. And what financial lenders can do is create a loan program for a specific category of person, such as a protected class. And so although the fair housing laws say that we cannot discriminate against certain categories, as we've seen through the presentation today, there is a large number of disparities that still exist. So a lender could create a loan program specifically for Black people, specifically for Latino people. And so collectively, through partnership with the Mortgage Bankers Association and with a nonprofit called Homeownership Council of America, we are developing a toolkit which will be a step-by-step guide for lenders to create a special purpose credit program. There are a few of them in operation, however, they are geographically based rather than racially explicit. Chase Bank does have one for certain geographies. I believe it's operating in the Chicago area, but again, that is tied to a certain geographic region rather than explicitly a race or national origin. Personally, those are not my favorite categories of special purpose credit programs, because I do think there's a little bit of a danger that they could perpetuate some segregation. And so what we're really hoping is that lenders will develop racially explicit programs that can be used to overcome some of these disparities. And so the reason that I mention these is really because A, they have not been used. B, the vast majority of people are not aware that they're even allowed to exist. And frankly, I didn't even know prior to joining NFHA. So I'm very, very excited at the prospect of using these to help close the homeownership, racial homeownership gaps. Now, lenders are naturally reticent to really lean into these because we are in such a societally fraught time in terms of racial. There's regulatory and legal aspects to this that make it challenging. We've seen just last summer, there was a lawsuit for a program for Black farmers to give them some financial relief. And there was a lawsuit that came from that. So unfortunately, these programs, as well-intentioned and as important as they can be, they're almost certain to be subject to legal scrutiny and to lawsuits. So I think that's where a lot of the hesitation is coming in for these to be really, really fully embraced. Now, here are some resources. I don't know, Farrah, if you want to hop back in here. Farrah and I have collected a number of books, some videos, and some other miscellaneous resources that can help. I realize that, on your screen, you can't furiously jot these down. So we'll make sure these slides and these resources get into the hands of Crystal to share with all of you. And I'll actually go back and say that, of course, some of these books here, Race for Profit, The Color of Law, these are all really specific to the real estate industry. Some of the others down here, The Warmth of Other Suns, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Inclusify. These are ones that really talk more to the DEI, the inclusion, some of the other foundational aspects. These videos here are also, videos and movies are also absolutely fantastic at explaining some of the issues, some of the history, because again, those are all so critical to understanding why we are where we are and why these issues are so important. Of course, NAR has some fantastic resources available. Fairhaven, if you have not made your way through that yet, I absolutely implore you to do that. I thought it was a really, really excellent, really excellent resource. At Home with Diversity, of course, is another great one. And all of the reports that I mentioned. So the NAHREP 2021 State of Hispanic Homeownership, ARIA has a similar report, NAREB has a similar report. So all of these reports really dive into the statistics of these certain demographics to better help prepare you and understand some of the issues at play and how you can use them in developing your own practices, your own programs, how you want to focus your efforts in your particular area. So Farrah, I think maybe you want to jump in there.
Sure. I mean, I think you covered a lot of ground that I would have covered, and I also want to point out, I love that you have that book on the list that we both read about Baltimore. What's his name? Anthony. It starts with a P, his last name, but anyhow, so that was a good book. There's another book that didn't end up on there about Levittown, but if you look for a book on Levittown and fair housing, I know NAR has it in their library. That's also a really good book. Anyhow, lots of great resources. And, so Laurie, I think there's some questions in the chat, and this is going to be a really interesting conversation because I think that we have an opportunity to, we've been telling folks what we came to talk about, and now we have an opportunity to really dive into some of the questions that are going to really help with some takeaways for the group. So I'm excited about this part of it.
Perfect. So this first question here I see is, these initiatives and ideas are great. How can we also make sure that we don't let anyone feel like a checkbox in our DEI initiatives, clients, mentors, other agents, etc.? So I will let you field that one, Farrah, because you are the DEI expert on this event.
I have ideas here, and so here's the thing. I think, you know, this is all about. I think a lot of the diversity and fair housing work starts with oneself, right? It's not just kind of taps on the shoulder. You know, I kind of make sure that I, you know, I do like the checkbox, like I do my website, and I make sure that my company has one of whatever each category or anything like that. I think really it's more about, even before you do that, even before you go there, is learning. So taking the time to read about different communities, listening to these voices of video that Laurie shared is amazing, things like that. Going to your local chapters of the multicultural real estate trade groups, which Laurie mentioned, you know, going to some of those presentations, taking an implicit bias course and reading about implicit bias, and continuing to work on where, you know, you might find yourself having bias, because we all have it. And so I feel like that gets you beyond kind of this performative, I'm checking boxes, yes, 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 because it's really starting to come from a deep inside understanding. And then you can take it to the next level. If you are in charge of running, you know, a group or an organization, thinking about some of the biases that restrict who gets to be involved in the group. So like hiring practices or leadership practices, are there clear criteria? Is there marketing that goes out or far and wide to say we have this opportunity on our team, or is it like just in my line of sight? Because I'm acutely aware that when I'm putting together panels, it's people I know, and our communities may reflect ourselves, but they may not reflect all of the diversity out there in the greater society and community that you really want to have access to. So, you know, kind of thinking about all of the systems that you get to have access to, and even if you're not in charge of developing them, speaking out about where something can be changed. You know, getting involved in your realtor associations and thinking about the process for getting on the board, getting on a committee, becoming an officer, you know, looking at ways to make that process more accessible for more people being more aware of them. All of those are things that will take it to where the system now starts to change. Because that's what you want, right? Like, you don't want it to be, I care about diversity, so now I've selected some diverse folks, but the next person who comes along has a system of selection for new employees or leadership that is still reflective of personal bias. It's not transparent. And now that is a heavy lift, because, you know, oftentimes these things have to change with others' approval and input. And these are systems that have become comfortable, they make sense, or even figuring out how to change it. There's some tensions there. This is easier said than done, but that's part of the process. So a book we might not have put in there, and I can put a link in the chat, is Erasing Institutional Bias. That's another one where we're talking about systems that you can be looking at and how to fix those. So I will stop at that one. I don't know, Laurie, you might have some comments and suggestions there. I know Mabel Guzman's question is really right up your alley as well.
Yeah, and now I'm nervous. Now that I see Mabel Guzman is here and watching, she's an NAR leader and an industry leader that I certainly look up to. So now I'm nervous. At any rate, but she asked a great question, and that says, since public policy created much of why we are where we are, what are some recommendations we should advocate for? And that is a great question, and it's also a really multi-layered question, because so obviously, you know, there's local, state, and national elements to public policy. And so from the national perspective, of course, a lot of the things that we at NFHA were pushing on, of course, were in the now, I don't know, stalled, defunct, I'm not sure what exactly is happening, but Build Back Better Act. You know, we really were pushing for funding for fair housing organizations, both private and public fair housing organizations, so that they can do the enforcement investigation work that needs to be done. Again, you know, we were talking about down payment assistance for first generation home buyers. That was a piece of that legislation. But on the state and local levels, you know, that's a matter of looking at what's happening in your area. I mentioned earlier about how realtors and realtor associations were instrumental in creating some of the negative aspects of the housing industry. So that collective force is so powerful to move forward. And I won't get into, you know, RPAC, because I know that that's a little bit of a tricky topic, and of course not the right forum for that. But the point is that realtors are paying attention to these issues. So I think that look at all the areas, not just housing related ones. You know, there are a lot of areas of the country. And I'm not sure about New Jersey, but there's a lot of areas of the country where LGBTQ individuals can still be discriminated against in employment. So, you know, look beyond, look at issues that touch on both, you know, touch on housing, of course, but also in the broader scope, diverse individuals. So that could be LGBT folks, that could be immigrants, you know, the DACA legislation, and you know, I think that's coming before the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of issues there surrounding this. And I would also say, because we are in a forum here talking to realtors and realtor organizations, I would encourage all of you to really take a close look at what is happening with NAR. Take a look at the issues that they're leaning into, and really hold them accountable, hold the leadership accountable. Now, I can say that I used to work for the Maryland Realtor Association. And so I can say, now that I'm working for a civil rights organization, I can say some of the things that association staff maybe can't, like Farrah and maybe Crystal as well. But absolutely look at where the RPAC dollars is being spent and who it's being given to. Look at the speakers that are invited to certain events. And I completely 100% understand why you want diverse attitudes, diverse viewpoints. That's very, very important. And maybe, you know, that's politically, so we're talking about the right and the left, conservative, liberal, however you want to talk about it. It's critical to have those converging viewpoints, but realtors are in a space now where you are being held accountable for your through the code of ethics for your, you know, social media. You know, you have to make sure that you are not using slurs, you know, saying things on social media, both personally and in business, that are, you know, considered discriminatory. So this is my personal view here. I don't think that that associations should have speakers that violate those things. If speakers are talking about using discriminatory terms, discriminatory actions on social media, I think that that those invitees should be held to the same standards as realtor members are. So that's a little bit of a soapbox for me there. But again, accountability. hold for those of you, I'm assuming all of you are, because you're, this is an association event. All of you, look to NAR and use your collective voices to reinforce and emphasize how important these fair housing and housing opportunity issues are. Don't let the associations, be meek about these efforts. If not now, then when? We're in a space of where a lot of these issues and disparities have come to light since the lynching of George Floyd. We're in this kind of racial reckoning in this country. And honestly, and Mabel, she did, put in the chat about discussions about reparations and to ensure removing systemic barriers. And again, I personally don't think that we can advance conversations about solutions without taking reparations into account. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what reparations are, what they look like, how they can be used. So I think there's a lot more education that needs to be done in that space. But absolutely, reparations should be part of the conversation when we're talking about racial equity, when we're talking about systemic barriers. So I'll take a breath there because I could really just keep going off on this one.
I do have something to add as far as policies, if it's okay, Crystal. I see you come back, but and also the reparations discussion. So I jotted down a few, and only because as a former realtor who was involved, both at the all at the local, state, and national level, some of these things were things that we were working on at the time, and some of the things are things that kind of through CAR and that we are supporting our members and working on. And I would say, think about the concept of disparate impact, particularly on the local level. Are there, and disparate impact is kind of a legal term of art where there's a racially or it's a neutral policy that has a worse impact on a particular group. It tends to disadvantage, and if it's not necessary. So we had all of these point of sale ordinances in my market, and really making the case, bringing the data that your clients of color are experiencing difficulty getting into home ownership because of this extra fee or cost or requirement. And those are things that you can go to city council meetings and talk about. Is your city and their budget looking at housing as something that they're working on, low income, affordable housing, and how much of that budget is going towards rental housing versus home ownership housing or down payment assistance programs, or I would say below market rate. But if you get involved as a realtor, making sure that these programs, if they are going to create them, and encourage them to create them, and then give input as to how those programs can be crafted. They have a budget for housing or something, or land use, how these budgets can be crafted to actually support access to home ownership that then doesn't disadvantage the people who use the programs, that helps to build wealth. So that doesn't, have such a harsh kind of equity sharing model where at the end of the day, they've paid more to get in and per month, and they're calling themselves a homeowner, but they lose money, or, that they don't, actually make it so their offer doesn't get accepted because they have so many hoops and they take so long to process the application for using the program that the person is either not competitive or in danger of losing their deposit because they thought they could remove a contingency, but that entity is still evaluating. Help create these programs though, because they're needed. And so I think those are some policies. And then and so these are not going to be new to Laurie or Mabel or Bill, but loan level pricing. So I don't think we have gotten to the place, and I'll explain what that is, with our federal policy and I think that are aware, and I could see the political will maybe potentially shifting, but so loan level pricing is where it's more expensive to get a loan if you have a lower down payment and a lower credit score. But we know communities of color tend to use credit differently. It may not be that they're not paying their rent on a regular basis, or they're not capable of paying their bills. Maybe they just don't use credit very much. Or we know about generational wealth differences that impact down payments. So if you've got a community that has less access to generational wealth, and they're going to have a more expensive loan, and when they do become a homeowner, it's going to cost them more, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy that they might be more likely to default on those loans, or they're going to build wealth more slowly. So, continuing to advocate for that to be equal across the board. It's something that we have policy to do at CAR. I know NAR does. And then some of the other things that are impacting, and I would say look at, whether you have a policy or what, but student loans, how those are treated, things that can help ameliorate will help, get certain folks with less generational wealth. And this is not just about race. People from the LGBTQ community tend to have less family support as well, including in college. And this is not across the board. It's just a dynamic that sometimes, can impact the LGBTQ community. So thinking about student loans, and then also we're all concerned, many of us, and I'm raising this because there are some policy things that, might come about, but bulk sales to investors, like the big institutional investors that actually take what would be a starter home or a home that someone would buy and own or occupy off the market and make it a rental home perpetually, does reduce the opportunity for first-time buyers. It increases the cost because there's competition on what is a more scarce product now, which would be the homes that are available to actually purchase and live in. And they're also competing on the market with cash, with, your first-time buyers who have less generational wealth may be using programs. And so, I don't have a particular policy. I would just say, be aware, look at it, maybe there's ways to craft some policy solutions that will address that. So, and I think I've covered my entire list. And what I will say about reparations is that Laurie made a great point about people having misunderstandings about it. Starting off with, first of all, having the community really aware of the history is important. So we understand, why we got to where we got, and why some people might be saying reparations would be something that can either start to address it or should be used to address it. And then having educational programs about what that is. I mean, we have a reparations task force in the state of California, and it comes up. Our members are asking questions. Some of the reparations task force investigation has to do with old housing policy and housing discrimination and then the resulting homeownership and wealth disparities. And so I think that a good beginning place, because I think people have a strong opinion sometimes, but helping people understand what that looks like. This is something that we do in our realtor communities all the time as we kind of determine which policies we might want to support or not. And it's just really important to get a full understanding of what we're talking about before, you can then have a conversation about whether you want to support something or how that support might look or what you might want to do there. And then it's not to suggest that the community would come down one way or the other, but the information is critical. And so I think that answers the questions I saw. But do we have time for any other questions? Anything else?
No, I think
yeah, it doesn't look like there's any more questions in the chat, which is we did it about an hour and a half today. So thank you, ladies. I really appreciate your time today. And just so everyone knows, we have a very strong diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative this year. We have a very strong diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. And just a couple of announcements so you guys are aware. We do have a webinar that's coming up that's on down payment assistance and programs that are going to be offered coming up on April 19th. It's not available on the website yet, but we're working on the final details and we'll get that out to you as soon as possible. And also, if you haven't taken the At Home with Diversity course, we do have it on the calendar. I don't have the date on hand, but I'll share it in the recap. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else. And I think that's pretty much it. And stay tuned to ncjr.com. Like I said, we have a very strong diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative with our president, Bill Flagg. And I just want to say a big thank you to him for bringing all of this together. And a thank you to you ladies for taking your time to give our members a wonderful presentation.
Thanks so much. And thank you, President Bill, for having us and for the association for all of your efforts. I really appreciate you inviting us. And I did want to just give a quick caveat in what some of my remarks about NAR should do this, NAR this. I am a member of NAR, so I'm not saying you should do this. I'm saying we should do this.
Yes.
So thank you again.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And you guys have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.